At exactly 4:03 a.m. my phone buzzed once and then lit up like a Christmas tree with alerts from the motion sensor at my front gate. The screen showed a grainy but unmistakable figure climbing my 8-foot steel gate in pajama pants and what looked like a sequin bathrobe. For a moment I thought it was a prank or some drunk teen pulling a late-night dare, but then the face turned slightly to the left and there it was, the unmistakable silhouette of Karen, the vice president of our HOA, crouched on top of my security gate like a raccoon ready to pounce, except raccoons don't usually carry clipboards or hiss HOA bylaws while trespassing on private property. I didn't even move from my bed, I just stared at the live feed from the surveillance app in disbelief. Karen, of all people, she had always been extra, but this was bold, even for her. The best part, she didn't know that the very gate she was clinging to like a jungle gym was wired to instantly alert local law enforcement through the emergency sheriff's node. A little over a year ago, I had been approved to install this direct connection due to my role as a part-time tech consultant for the sheriff cyber unit. That gate didn't just record her, it streamed her in real time to every available unit within a 5-mile radius, complete with facial recognition and time stamp. While she carefully shimmied down the inner frame of the gate, muttering about my supposedly unapproved yard lights, I got up, brewed a pot of coffee, and waited for the inevitable sirens. The irony was almost poetic. Karen had once tried to fine me for hanging wind chimes that made too much noise, and now here she was triggering a law enforcement response before sunrise on a Tuesday. 3 minutes later the flashing red and blue lights hit my windows, and the deep rumble of a patrol vehicle announced its arrival. I stepped onto my porch, coffee in hand, just as Karen was stepping foot on my driveway, looking like she was auditioning for a suburban version of Mission Impossible. The deputy who got out of the cruiser recognized me immediately. He nodded politely, and then spotted Karen. She froze, clipboard in hand, still whispering to herself about code compliance like a malfunctioning robot. "Ma'am, step back please," he said. As he approached her, she turned to him, as if she were the one calling the shots. "I'm with the HOA," she snapped. "I'm conducting a neighborhood inspection for violations at this address." At 4 o'clock in the morning, the deputy said, raising an eyebrow, "That's not an inspection, that's trespassing." Karen opened her mouth to argue but stopped short as I pulled out my phone and showed them both the security footage. I had zoomed in clean angles from 3 different lenses, including thermal overlay for extra flair. The deputy watched maybe 10 seconds before nodding and cuffing her right there on my driveway. It was strange watching someone who once walked around like a self-appointed monarch of the block, now sputtering in disbelief as her Miranda rights were read. Her favorite phrase, "I'm on the board," didn't seem to carry much weight anymore. As she was loaded into the back of the cruiser, I couldn't help but think back to how this ridiculous feud even began. It wasn't always like this. There was a time Karen just sent passive-aggressive notes and dropped off laminated flyers about overgrown shrubs, but then she got elected to the HOA board, and suddenly the entire neighborhood turned into her personal kingdom. It started small. A fine here, a warning there. She once cited a neighbor for having a birdhouse that clashed with the approved neighborhood palette, whatever that means. Another time, she tried to get a trampoline removed from a backyard because it was a, quote, potential aerial threat to neighboring properties. I wish I was joking. I became a target shortly after declining to join her petition to remove all solar panels, claiming they caused visual disruption and electromagnetic interference. I calmly explained I held a federal license to install those panels under a green tech program, and that I had actually helped design the very electromagnetic shielding tech she was ranting about. That didn't sit well with her. Over the next few weeks, I received a barrage of violation notices, one for leaving my trash bin out 2 hours early, another for parking my truck slightly angled in my own driveway, but I let it all slide, figuring she'd burn herself out. Then came the incident with my generator that was the turning point. During a storm, she accused me of running unauthorized wiring to power my house, and actually called in a complaint which led to a temporary shutoff. The thing she didn't know, my younger brother, who lives with me, uses a powered medical bed that relies on that generator. The outage nearly put him in the hospital. It was the last straw. I filed a report, consulted legal counsel, and after an investigation she was forced to sign a settlement agreement and was warned not to come near my property again. That agreement was still in effect tonight. And yet here she was scaling my gate in the dark like a wannabe ninja trying to catch me for leaving decorative string lights on after hours. The sun was just beginning to rise as the cruiser pulled away. I stood in my driveway sipping my coffee staring at the gate she climbed, and shook my head. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. By 8 o'clock the neighborhood Facebook page was on fire. Someone had already uploaded security footage, probably shared by the responding deputy, because let's face it, even cops love a good HOA story. The comments section was a glorious mess. Some people were shocked, others were celebrating with digital popcorn memes, and someone even edited the footage with Mission Impossible music. Karen's defenders were few and far between, mostly silent, but one person, a woman named Dolores, posted that we shouldn't mock someone going through a mental health crisis. That might have carried more weight if Karen hadn't posted a selfie just days earlier with a quote about bringing order back to chaos and tagging the HOA bylaws as sacred scripture. By lunchtime a neighbor I barely knew handed me a box of donuts and whispered thanks for finally taking her down. Another guy asked if I could install his cameras too. He had a raccoon problem but winked when he said it. I didn't say much, just smiled and returned to my workshop in the backyard. That workshop was more than a hobby space. It was a control center of sorts, equipped with feeds from every corner of my property, a server stack tucked beneath a workbench, and a real-time alert system synced with both my phone and the sheriff's department. It wasn't just security, it was accountability. I reviewed the footage again, this time in slow motion, zooming in on Karen's face. As she climbed the gate her expression was intense, determined, like she thought she was saving the neighborhood from a code apocalypse. There was no hesitation, no fear. That was the most disturbing part. She truly believed she was above the law. But what Karen didn't understand, what she refused to accept, was this: I wasn't just another homeowner trying to mind his business. I was someone who knew how to play her game better than she did, and I played with facts, footage, and flawless timing. And the best part, one had only just started warming up. The buzz around the neighborhood the next morning was louder than a 4th of July parade. While Karen sat somewhere in a holding cell trying to explain why she was dressed like a rhinestoned burglar, my front porch became the unofficial gathering spot for the entire block. People walked by a little slower than usual, waved longer, and wore grins they didn't even try to hide. Some neighbors dropped casual comments, pretending to talk about the weather while clearly angling for more details. One even brought coffee just to ask about the new security system. It was surreal. I never wanted to be the center of neighborhood drama, but when your gate footage goes mini-viral and ends with the HOA vice president in cuffs, you don't get to choose the spotlight. You just manage it. But to understand how we got to this level of ridiculousness, you have to know the full story behind Karen. She didn't start off climbing gates and quoting bylaws like scripture. No, she began as that overly involved neighbor who always smiled a second too long and asked way too many questions about your garbage pickup schedule. When she first moved in, Karen actually threw a neighborhood potluck. Everyone came. She brought casseroles and printed flyers about community cleanliness. It all seemed innocent enough. But over time, her obsession with order became less about community and more about control. The turning point for many of us came during what we now call the barbecue incident. It was a Saturday afternoon, kids were laughing, someone had brought a bounce house, and the Johnsons were grilling ribs in their driveway. Everything was perfect until Karen showed up with a clipboard and a measuring tape. She marched straight up to the grill, waved a paper in the air, and declared the barbecue a fire hazard. People thought she was joking, until she called the fire department. The fire crew showed up, visibly annoyed, and after a quick inspection, left without action. But Karen? She fined the Johnsons the next day for blocking community airflow with smoke plumes. No one even knew that was a thing. She ran for HOA office the following year under the slogan, "Preserve and Protect," and somehow won. From that moment on, our peaceful neighborhood transformed into what felt like a gated dictatorship. She started issuing citations for the most absurd infractions. A child's chalk drawing on a driveway was considered graffiti. A welcome mat with a quote was deemed inappropriate messaging. One time, she issued a $150 fine to a neighbor because their holiday wreath had non-standard ribbon colors. It didn't matter if you were a quiet retiree or a young family trying to enjoy the weekends. If you didn't fit Karen's rigid mold, you were on her radar. I managed to stay under that radar for a while. I kept my yard neat, didn't throw loud parties, and followed the basic rules. But then came the generator episode, and that changed everything. It was a stormy night, and power lines across the city were down. My brother, who suffers from a medical condition that requires constant power for his bed and monitor, relied on our backup generator. We'd gotten special permits for it and even had it registered through the local utilities board. But Karen decided to go full vigilante. She sent a complaint to the city claiming I was running an illegal energy operation. Within hours, power officials were on my property demanding to inspect the system. When they found everything in order, they left without issue, but not before Karen made a scene in the rain, waving a laminated copy of the HOA Energy Clause and demanding enforcement. The real damage came when her complaints led to a 12-hour delay in our generator switchover during a maintenance error. My brother had to be rushed to the hospital for emergency stabilization. That night, I decided I wasn't going to let her slide anymore. I compiled every interaction, every notice, and every piece of unnecessary drama she'd directed at me. I brought in a lawyer, and after a 3-week legal battle that involved HOA record audits and community witness testimonies, Karen agreed to a private settlement. The terms were simple. She'd stay away from my property. She'd cease all direct citations against me. And if she violated either, the legal consequences would be fast and severe. But of course, Karen couldn't help herself. The last straw wasn't the gate climb. It was what happened a few days before that made it clear she was spiraling. I'd gotten a notice from the HOA mailbox, not even addressed properly, stating that my yard lights were non-compliant because they disrupted nocturnal wildlife migration. That would have been mildly amusing if it wasn't paired with a printed photo of my front yard taken at night. The angle of the photo made it clear it was taken from inside my fence line. Someone had been on my property. That's when I upgraded my surveillance system, added infrared coverage, and connected it directly to the sheriff's cybercrime unit under my consulting clearance. I didn't just want proof this time. I wanted justice. Karen's obsession with power wasn't just some quirky personality trait. It was a full-blown compulsion. She needed to be the enforcer, the one setting the rules. But she never stopped to consider that not everyone was going to roll over and play along. Especially not me. I had the tools, the legal background, and the will to stand up to her nonsense. But even more than that, I had the receipt. Literal digital receipts of every violation, every petty demand, and every overreach of authority. After her arrest, the HOA scrambled to recover. They issued a vague statement about regrettable behavior and respecting personal privacy. But it was clear the board was shaken. Karen had been their enforcer, their spear tip, and now she was exposed on camera, ranting on my driveway in the middle of the night like a rogue cartoon villain. The community response was overwhelming. People began digging through their own citation record. They compared stories, laughed about shared infractions, and some even began talking about forming a new board altogether. What Karen didn't realize when she scaled my gate wasn't just that she was triggering alarms. She was setting off a chain reaction she couldn't control. Her climb became symbolic. It was the moment she crossed from annoying authority figure into full-blown liability. And that symbol was everywhere now. Memes with her image mid-climb. T-shirts someone started printing that said gate goals with a silhouette of her in midair. Even a coffee mug with the phrase "climb fences not right." As I sat in my backyard workshop the day after her arrest, I couldn't help but chuckle at the absurdity of it all. The same gate she tried to find me for months ago was now the very thing that caught her red-handed. It wasn't just poetic justice. It was earned justice. And something told me this was just the beginning. Karen might have thought she ran the neighborhood. but now the neighborhood was ready to run her out. By the following morning, the neighborhood was practically humming with gossip, whispers, and a strange blend of vindication and disbelief. Karen's name was on every tongue, from the retired couples out walking their tiny dogs to the teens biking around with earbuds in and cameras ready, hoping to catch another viral moment. Someone had already posted a slowed-down version of Karen's gate-climbing footage with circus music laid over it. Another neighbor edited it to include video game sound effects every time her foot slipped. The footage was spreading like wildfire, not just within the community, but across city-based Facebook groups and even a local subreddit. People from neighboring counties were chiming in with their own Karen stories, some wondering how one person could generate so much chaos from behind a picket fence. But while the memes were amusing and the online commentary wildly entertaining, the real story was happening just a few blocks down at the HOA clubhouse. The board had called an emergency meeting. Of course, it wasn't exactly public knowledge. Karen had trained them well in the art of exclusivity and private decision-making. But they had forgotten something rather important. I still legally owned the land the HOA clubhouse was built on. Years ago, the original property developer had sold the HOA a long-term lease on that little patch of land, but never transferred the title. I'd purchased it as part of a tax auction, not even realizing the small building was technically on my property until much later when I did a title sweep. When I informed the board last year, they all nodded, smiled, and then tried to ignore it. They figured as long as I didn't make a fuss, they could keep operating like nothing had changed. And I didn't until now. So when the HOA board members tried to unlock the building that morning, they found a new lock. My lock. I had changed the code, installed a camera above the door, and left a simple printed note taped to the entrance that read, "Emergency meetings require emergency approval. Please contact the landowner for access." Underneath that, I'd printed my number and a QR code linking to a copy of the deed. Some neighbors saw them standing outside, confused and annoyed, and the photos of the locked-out board began making the rounds online. One shot had the president of the board tapping his key card repeatedly against the door like he expected it to magically open if he tried hard enough. It didn't. Instead of their secretive meeting, the neighborhood got a very different kind of event. I rolled out my portable grill, connected the speakers on my back deck, and invited everyone for an impromptu code compliance celebration. I played music, cooked burgers, and projected the Karen Gate video on a loop across a hanging bedsheet using a projector I borrowed from my office. Families came out with lawn chairs. People brought chips and coolers. Even the Johnsons, the victims of the infamous barbecue fine, showed up with a homemade cake shaped like a clipboard. On top it read, "You're not above the law." It wasn't just a party. It was a reckoning. For years, people had been quietly tolerating the suffocating atmosphere Karen had created. The fear of fines, the random inspections, the veiled threats about community standards, it all came bubbling to the surface now that someone had stood up and pushed back hard enough for it to make a difference. There was a sense of release in the air, as if the whole neighborhood had been holding its breath and could finally exhale. But even as the laughter and grilling continued, I got a quiet tap on my shoulder that shifted the tone completely. It was a man in a navy blue button-up, sunglasses perched on his head, and a badge clipped to his belt. He introduced himself as Assistant Director Langston from the Mayor's Community Affairs Office. That got my attention quickly. He asked if we could speak in private, and I took him into my workshop where the surveillance feeds were still playing across multiple screens. Langston got straight to the point. They had received multiple complaints about Karen, not just from our neighborhood, but from people across several HOAs where she had previously served or volunteered. He said her pattern of behavior had triggered a formal inquiry, and her arrest had accelerated that process. Apparently, she had recently submitted a grant application to the city for community beautification improvements, claiming she was acting on behalf of our HOA. The application had been flagged because it included forged digital signatures, including mine. That revelation stunned me. It wasn't enough that she harassed her neighbors, now she was trying to manipulate city funds in our names. Langston explained that Karen had requested a $40,000 grant for improvements that didn't exist. She had claimed to install solar lighting, build handicap ramps, and upgrade community trash systems. The inspection photos she submitted were fakes, photoshopped or pulled from unrelated properties. And to make matters worse, she had listed herself as the primary vendor for the landscaping company that would carry out the work. Langston asked if I'd be willing to provide any evidence that could help their investigation. I pulled up not just the gate footage, but the time-stamped delivery logs, landscaping records, and a copy of Karen's own notices about denying installation of solar lights just weeks earlier. He smiled when he saw it and said this might move the case from fraud into felony territory. That was when it hit me. Karen hadn't just crossed lines, she had sprinted past them with her clipboard raised like a sword. As the day wore on, things escalated further. A local journalist who covered city politics called me after someone forwarded them the viral video. She wanted a comment. I declined, but told her I'd be happy to send her public records. She asked a single question before hanging up. Is it true she called the cops on a disabled child for using sidewalk chalk? I confirmed that yes, she had. By sunset, the HOA board had split into two camps. Some wanted to suspend Karen indefinitely and hold new elections. Others panicked and wanted to distance themselves altogether, claiming they didn't know what she was really doing. But the truth was they all knew. Maybe not about the grant fraud, but they'd seen her tactics. They let her run wild because she kept the neighborhood in line and they didn't want to challenge her. Now that it had exploded in their faces, they were scrambling. Late that night, after most of the guests had gone home, I sat alone on the porch and watched the streetlights flicker on one by one. The breeze was cool, the air quiet. No Karen notes taped to my door. No random inspections, just peace. But I knew it wouldn't last long. Karen was out on bail, and knowing her, she wouldn't back down. She'd come back swinging, probably with accusations, probably with fake witnesses or some desperate attempt to reclaim control. But this time, she wasn't up against just me. She was up against the truth, the evidence, and a neighborhood that had finally woken up. And the next time she tried anything, it wouldn't be a gate camera catching her in the act. It would be an entire community ready to shut her down before she could even climb the first rung. 2 weeks later the day finally arrived when Karen had to stand before a judge. Despite all her bravado and the rumors she was spinning on the neighborhood chat claiming she had been unlawfully detained and that I had doctored the footage, the truth was marching toward her like a freight train. The courtroom was packed tighter than a high school gym on homecoming night. Every seat in the gallery was filled mostly by our own neighbors, many of whom had come not just out of curiosity, but as potential witnesses. The woman who once ruled the HOA with an iron clipboard was now sitting silently at the defendant's table, looking smaller than any of us had ever seen her. I sat behind the prosecution with a folder full of documents, surveillance screenshots, email records, and a USB drive that contained every second of her 4 a.m. gate scaling performance. I hadn't planned on testifying that day, but I was ready. The state had already built a solid case based on criminal trespass, prior court violation, and a newly added count of attempted fraud due to her bogus city grant application. Karen's lawyer, a man who looked like he hadn't won a case since the 90s, kept whispering furiously to her while she sat staring straight ahead, blinking too often like someone trying not to cry or scream. The judge, a no-nonsense woman in her early 60s, glanced over the charges and leaned back in her chair as the courtroom quieted. The first bit of evidence was the surveillance footage, which the prosecutor played without commentary. There was Karen in full-resolution bathrobe fluttering like a cape as she clambered up my gate, flashlight clenched in her teeth. A few people in the gallery chuckled, but the judge held up a hand and silence returned. The moment she dropped down onto my property and triggered the internal alarms, you could practically feel the temperature in the room drop. When the part played where she began muttering to herself about code violations at 4 in the morning, the prosecutor paused the footage and looked toward the defense table. Karen's lawyer stood and began what must have been his most hopeful defense. He claimed Karen had simply been doing her duty as an HOA officer, that she had reasonable suspicion of code violations and believed she had the right to enter the premises under emergency inspection provisions. The judge asked him one question: what emergency could possibly require a code inspection at 4 in the morning with no prior notice on a property clearly marked private and under a restraining order? He stammered and said something about safety risks before quickly moving on. That was when the prosecution unveiled the real bombshell. A separate subpoena had been issued to search Karen's residence following the fraud investigation. During the search, law enforcement recovered physical printouts of neighborhood satellite maps annotated with handwritten notes and flagged properties. My house had been highlighted in red ink with words like non-compliant and target written across it. She also had a folder labeled Code Raid Plans, which contained a checklist of properties and what she believed were violations she could use to justify fines or citations. One of those documents included a fabricated record of a violation she had intended to backdate. It was a level of premeditation that turned the entire case against her from petty trespassing into full-on obsession. As the evidence mounted, Karen began shifting in her seat, her composure cracking little by little. Her hands trembled visibly, and she looked over her shoulder as if hoping someone would jump up and defend her. But the faces behind her weren't sympathetic. They were the faces of the very people she'd harassed, fined, and threatened for years. There was Mr. Collins, whom she had fined for having decorative shutters. There was the Jennings couple, whom she'd once accused of running a black market dog grooming business because they owned 3 Pomeranians. There was even old Mrs. Dupree, who had almost been evicted for installing a mobility ramp without pre-approval. And every one of them had shown up not for revenge but for justice. When my name was called, I stood calmly, walked to the front, and took the oath. The prosecutor asked me to explain my relationship with the defendant and described the events of that morning. I kept it brief, factual, and professional. I explained the history of her harassment, the past settlement agreement, the installation of the security system, and the automatic alert to local law enforcement. Then I walked them through the footage, highlighting the timestamps that matched the sheriff's dispatch log. I handed over the hard copies of Karen's notices and photographs and confirmed they were delivered under her authority as HOA vice president. The judge asked me one question directly. She wanted to know why I had gone to such great lengths to secure my property. I told her the truth. Because my younger brother's life depended on it. That we'd already experienced a dangerous power interruption due to her interference. That her actions weren't just annoying or overbearing, they were dangerous and unlawful. The courtroom was completely silent as I spoke. Karen wouldn't meet my eyes. After a brief recess, the judge returned with her decision. Karen was found guilty of trespassing, harassment, and violation of a court order. The fraud charges were forwarded to the district attorney for further prosecution. She was sentenced to community service fines and a court-mandated psychological evaluation. But most importantly, she was banned from serving on any HOA board for a minimum of 5 years and ordered to stay 200 feet away from my property and any member of my immediate family. Karen didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just sat there, stunned and motionless, like the air had finally been sucked out of her personal universe. As she was escorted out of the courtroom, a few of the neighbors applauded softly, not out of cruelty, but because they finally felt free. Outside in the hallway, people were shaking hands and hugging like a war had just ended. One neighbor handed me a small envelope and said it was a thank you from a few of the residents. Inside was a gift card to a local restaurant and a handwritten note that simply read, "Thank you for standing up when the rest of us were too tired to." I slipped it into my pocket and smiled. I hadn't done any of this for praise or applause. I did it because someone had to. The rest of the day passed in a kind of quiet celebration. The HOA board issued a formal statement announcing Karen's suspension and declaring a temporary pause on all citations until new elections could be held. Residents flooded the suggestion box with ideas for how to make the neighborhood feel like a community again. Some people proposed removing the surveillance-style inspections altogether. Others wanted more block parties and family night. It was like a veil had been lifted, and everyone could finally breathe again. Later that night, I sat on my back porch and watched the lights flicker across the neighborhood. It looked different now, not in appearance but in energy. There was a sense of calm and hope. The gate was still there, the cameras still rolled, but there was no longer a sense of waiting for the next ridiculous notice to show up in the mailbox. Karen's shadow no longer stretched across the lawns. But I knew it wasn't the end. There were still things to address, reforms to push through, and people to protect. Karen might have been knocked off her self-made pedestal, but others like her could rise, if we weren't vigilant. Still, as I sat there sipping my tea and scrolling through the messages of support from neighbors old and new, I allowed myself a rare feeling. Peace. Not just for me but for the whole block. And deep down I knew one thing for sure. The next time someone thought about weaponizing a clipboard and a rulebook, they'd think twice before climbing over the wrong gate. The final weeks after the trial felt like waking up in a new version of the same neighborhood. The trees were still the same, the fences hadn't moved an inch, and the sidewalks hadn't magically widened, but something invisible had changed. People were talking more, waving longer, even letting their kids ride bikes without constantly looking over their shoulders for some clipboard-wielding enforcer hiding behind a bush. It wasn't just relief, it was recovery. The kind that only comes after years of tension finally snap and unravel. Karen's absence wasn't just noticed, it was celebrated quietly in small, meaningful ways. A lawn flamingo returned here, a string of fairy lights flickered on there, and a porch wind chime sang where silence had once been demanded. The HOA board, now operating without their self-appointed queen, was scrambling to clean up the mess. Their statements came out with carefully worded phrases like regrettable oversight and temporary misalignment with community values. No one really bought it, but nobody pushed either. Most of them had turned a blind eye to Karen's antics until she made the mistake of crossing the one person prepared to document, prove, and push back harder than she ever imagined. Elections were on the horizon now, and the neighborhood buzzed with conversations about reform. A group of residents led by the Johnsons and an older gentleman named Felix had started a grassroots campaign to replace the entire board with people who actually lived in the real world and didn't treat overgrown hedges like felony offenses. I stayed mostly out of it, offering tech support when needed and providing digital copies of the HOA's past violation logs to neighbors preparing their campaign materials. The truth was, I didn't want a seat at their table. I'd already played my part and burned enough energy dealing with Karen's chaos. What I wanted was my peace and to make sure this place never went backward again. My attention turned back to my work, to my family, and to my brother, who was finally sleeping better now that the lights on our property weren't monitored by binoculars from a car that idled for hours just outside the gate. But just as things were beginning to settle, a surprise arrived in my mailbox that nearly knocked me out of my routine again. It was a thick envelope, official-looking, marked with a state seal. Inside was a letter from the office of the Attorney General. The fraud division had picked up Karen's case from the local level and was preparing a larger civil suit regarding her misappropriation of community grant applications. Turns out, our HOA wasn't the only one she had submitted documents for. Several other neighborhoods from her past involvement reported nearly identical schemes, all using similar language and forged signatures. My footage, documentation, and testimony had triggered a cascade effect. Karen's legacy was about to be dismantled piece by something more powerful than any neighborhood whisper campaign: cold, hard legal consequence. They requested my participation as a witness in a statewide inquiry and attached a formal recognition letter citing my assistance in exposing the scam. I never imagined holding someone accountable with a security system, and some common sense would put me on an official report signed by the state's top legal officers. But there it was. I scanned it once, folded it back into the envelope, and tucked it away with a bittersweet smile. I wasn't done with Karen's story, not yet. But this part of it was no longer mine to carry. In the spirit of moving on, the neighborhood held its first open gathering in years. It wasn't a protest, a complaint session, or a stern board meeting. It was a block party. Actual invitations went out. Bounce houses were inflated, grills lit up, kids chalked up the sidewalks without fear of fines, and neighbors shared food, stories, and long overdue laughter. People shook off the weight that had hung in the air for too long. They didn't mention Karen much, and when they did, it was with the same tone you might use for a bad storm that finally passed through. One of the best parts of that day came from the least expected place. A teenager named Leo approached me nervously with a small flash drive in hand. He said he was into video editing and animation, and that he'd made something for fun based on everything that had happened. He asked if he could show it on the big screen we had set up for movie night. I said sure, not expecting much. What followed was a 10-minute animated short that retold the entire Karen saga, from gate climbing to courtroom drama, using pixelated characters and absurdly dramatic narration. The audience howled with laughter, especially when Pixel Karen declared "I am the law" and got dunked into a pixelated trash bin. The animation ended with a simple message in white text on black. Real neighbors protect each other, not punish each other. Later that night, someone handed me a gift bag. Inside was a handcrafted wooden sign carved with the words "Karen's Climb" and the date of the incident. It wasn't cruel or mocking, it was commemorative. A reminder. They wanted to mount it on the inside of the gate as a neighborhood keepsake, and I agreed. It now hangs beneath one of the security cameras, polished and sealed against the weather, a small quiet testament to what happens when power is misused and people finally say enough. Things didn't end there. In the following weeks, the new interim board passed several motions. All citations issued in the last 12 months were suspended pending review. Surveillance practices were redefined and restricted. Fines could no longer be issued without a physical meeting and vote. But the most impactful change came from a motion proposed by Felix, one that required all board members to sign a community ethics pledge and undergo annual transparency audit. It passed with a unanimous vote. Karen, meanwhile, had sold her home within days of her court sentence and moved out under the cover of darkness. No one saw the moving truck. No one cared. The house was quickly snapped up by a young couple who installed a backyard hammock and painted their front door turquoise, both violations under the old regime. But no one said a word. No complaints. Just smiles and a plate of cookies from the neighbors. On the final weekend of that month, as the sun dipped behind the hills and cast a golden glow across the rooftops, I stood on my porch looking out at the gate that started it all. The climbing vines had begun creeping up its sides again. Birds chirped nearby. Somewhere a dog barked in the distance and no one found it. I felt the kind of silence that isn't empty, but full of peace, of recovery, of knowing that sometimes doing the hard thing is what makes the difference for everyone else who couldn't. I had never wanted to become the neighborhood's accidental hero. But if standing up meant my brother slept better, families stopped feeling afraid, and joy could return to simple things like sidewalk chalk and garden gnomes, then it was worth every second. And as I turned to go inside, I glanced one last time at the sign on the gate. Karen's Climb. It didn't feel like a warning anymore. It felt like a landmark. Place where everything changed. A point in time when someone said enough is enough and backed it up with evidence, resolve, and a camera feed that streamed justice live for the world to see.